Hello and welcome. A disturbing videotape showing Mexican police undergoing brutal torture training has caused an uproar from human rights groups, especially as the instructors from a US private security firm. The video recording emerged a week ago and just one day after President George Bush signed the first year of the $1.6 billion Merida Initiative into law, giving the Mexican military and police US training, armament and resources. The tape shows Mexican police being given tough torture training, including officers forcing their colleagues to crawl through vomit and injecting carbonated water up the noses of others. A local newspaper, El Heraldo de León, first revealed the practices, and in spite of protests and investigation by human rights groups, local Mexican officials defended the training methods, denied the illegality of the torture, and vowed to continue, while condemning the media for reporting the story. On today's program, we examine these practices and the political ramifications in Mexico and beyond, as we ask, what are the human rights standards in Mexico, and are US standards making torture more accepted? Don't forget, we take your calls on the show and you can reach us at the numbers at the bottom of your screen. Joining me for the discussion, I have from Mexico City, Laura Carlsen, the director of the Mexico City-based Americas program of the Center for International Policy, a think tank working to promote a US foreign policy based on international cooperation, demilitarization and respect for basic human rights. Here in Washington, D.C., I'm joined by Tamara, a lawyer with Human Rights Watch, who can give us some perspective on where such torture techniques stand in the eyes of the law. Welcome both of you. And Tara, if I could, hi there, Laura. And Tara, if I could start by asking if you know, from your perspective, in reality, is this tape revealing anything new? Is it doing anything? Is it? How seriously should we be taking this tape about the torture techniques?
What this tape clearly shows is that the Mexican police forces are not receiving the training they need to receive. Torture is not new in Mexico. It's been a widespread problem for years. Hundreds of cases have been documented, and there's good reason to believe that the documented cases are just the tip of the iceberg. So what I would say that these tapes clearly show that instead of being trained to respect human rights, the police forces are actually being trained for the opposite, and that's worrisome.
I'll put an email to you, actually, we got from New Jersey here in the USA, if I may. And Joseph Kelly wrote in saying, "It is unremarkable that this administration condones torture any place in the world. This is a sick government, and it will continue to be as long as the American people look the other way." Referring, of course, to this tape now. I guess we should point out it wasn't American government personnel involved in this demonstration, but a private security firm. Now, to what extent does that clear the US government from wrongdoing?
The US government has been practicing very serious human rights violations in different countries. This is a problem of the Mexican government and how the Mexican government deals with its human rights problems. This does not clean the US from its responsibility in terms of torture and other abuses, but I wouldn't say the tape is linked to the US government directly.
Okay, Laura Carlsen, glad you could join us from Mexico City, and I wonder, how do you view the timing of the tape being revealed just a day after President Bush signed the Merida Initiative, which is, of course, as I mentioned, a security agreement that involves the US and Mexico?
Well, for many of us in Mexico City, this confirmed our worst fears. What we saw from this tape were two things. First of all, that human rights abuses in Mexico are not isolated occurrences. They're systematic and they're institutionalized, as we could see from the training involved here. In some ways, what was even more shocking than the gruesome images that are seen on the videos is the response of the León, Guanajuato authorities after the videos were released. They did, as you mentioned, defend the tapes. They said that there were no violations here and that they needed to do this in the context of the war on terrorism and the war, particularly in Mexico, the war on organized crime. What we see from this is another grave concern that has to do with the timing of it taking place right after the signing of Plan Mexico. And that is that with the launching of the offensive on organized crime in Mexico, now supported by the US government, it's created a climate in which there is a sort of a war mentality. The Plan Mexico program that was adopted by the Congress and the US government is exclusively a security program, and that's making many of these officials think that they can use these kinds of tactics with impunity.
Well, Laura, what would you have proposed they do in terms? What would you propose that the U.S. government do then in terms of, if it is supposed to be providing some kind of training and some kind of armament? support for the Mexican police, and especially the fight against the drug cartels. What would you propose they do?
I think it was a grave mistake for Congress to have passed the Merida Initiative, often called Plan Mexico. By focusing the drug war exclusively on security and assistance to the military and the police forces in Mexico, they've overlooked some of the root causes of what's going on, and they've also empowered security forces that are not properly trained in human rights and that will likely use this aid to create even greater levels of impunity. I think what could have been done and what should be done in the future is look to an aid package that will go to the root causes of some of the drug war issues that have to do with consumption and rehabilitation, as well as working with Mexico on the problems of impunity that exist in the country. In many ways, I think the United States government is not the adequate entity to take on this task. The United States government has a terrible reputation worldwide on human rights, and when they put stipulations in the Merida Initiative saying that Mexico must now maintain the prohibition on the use of testimony obtained through torture and prohibit torture in their practices, many people in Mexico view it as hypocritical.
Tamara, one thing that we should point out, and it's something you and I were talking about before the show, is that out of the money that's being put forward by the US for this initiative, 15% only is accountable, so to speak, isn't it? Explain that to me. How does that work?
Well, this has been a very long process and a very long debate. When the Bush administration sent the Merida Initiative package to Congress, he was essentially asking Congress to give Mexico a blank check, giving them $500 million to combat drug trafficking and violence related to organized crime. The question from our point of view early on has not been whether or not to pass Merida. Instead, the question has been whether this package will include some sort of human rights requirements. Very early on, this proposal had support from the Democrats and the Republicans in Congress. So the debate has been how to ensure that this money that is given to the Mexican security forces, both the military and the police, which have very poor human rights records, could be used somehow as leverage to improve their human rights records and accountability. And after a very long process and a very disappointing overreaction by the Mexican government initially, calling these conditions an infringement on their sovereignty and unacceptable, Congress ended up including 4 human rights requirements, which I think are pretty encouraging.
Laura Carlsen, tell me about the initiative that you undertook recently, where you actually went around gauging opinion in Mexico on the situation there.
10 years ago, an International Civil Commission on Human Rights was formed. It began in Europe and began to include other countries as well. So this year, this commission came on a fact-finding mission to Mexico to study testimonies in 3 places: the state of Oaxaca, the state of Chiapas, and San Salvador Atenco. These are 3 places, in fact, that are mentioned in the Merida Initiative where there have been grave violations of human rights. And we were just astounded, because after 10 years, what we were able to see is that the human rights violations not only continue, but there's significant evidence that they're on the rise. In Oaxaca, for example, there was a repression of a local uprising that led to 28 deaths and the arrests of many people who were tortured in custody. In San Salvador Atenco, the same thing happened in May of 2006 with women raped in detention. These cases, including the cases in Chiapas, which have to do with many of the Zapatista indigenous communities that have been harassed and subject to arbitrary detentions, tortures, and beatings. These cases have been met with a lack of response on the part of the officials to prosecute them, because many of the culprits in these cases are the security forces themselves. So it was a shocking experience, and it was very sobering in that what we've seen as part of the rise in the human rights violations from this year over last year in particularly has to do with pretenses that are taking place within this war on organized crime, and the military going in and taking a greater role in the communities without without maintaining human rights, with human rights conditions.
Now, Tamara, one of the issues is, I gather also that until now, until a constitutional reform in Mexico, that there was no presumption of innocence. That is, people were not presumed innocent until found guilty.
There were a few rulings that said that people did have a right to presumption of innocence, but it was not included in the Constitution. After various attempts to modify the Constitution, last month President Calderon signed into law a comprehensive justice reform package, which includes, among other things, the presumption of innocence in the Constitution.
So basically, the way the security forces could take it is that they could literally beat confessions out of people and submit them in court and assume that the crime was solved.
You're absolutely right. The main reason, or one of the main reasons why torture is so widespread in Mexico is that coerced confessions or information obtained through torture is used as evidence in trial. And therefore, it's much easier for a prosecutor or a police officer to beat a confession out of someone and use that information to close a case than to carry out a thorough and reliable investigation.
So Laura Carlsen, to what extent does the revelation of this tape and the training that was witnessed in the tape, obviously it may not have much resonance with Mexicans who see the police behaving in this way as far as they're concerned on a daily basis, but what sort of implication does it have in revealing a presence of a US, at least US personnel, whether they be military or not?
Well, just several days ago, the online newspaper Narco News discovered that the company that was in charge of this training session, according to the evidence that they've presented, is called Risks Incorporated, and it's based both in Miami, Florida, and in London, England. The English-speaking trainer that you see on the tape, who has the man dragged through his own vomit, is, according to this information, a British soldier, ex-soldier, who fought in anti-terrorist units in North Ireland and was later formed part of this private firm. And the Spanish speaker is a Cuban-American who has close ties to anti-Castro paramilitary organizations. If you look at this site, the first thing that you notice is that human rights isn't even in their lexicon. This is a company that prides itself on specializing in forms of psychological torture that do not leave physical marks. Under Plan Mexico, what we have is funding specifically for contracts to enable these private companies to come down and do some of that training that we're talking about. We've been analyzing this since before it was announced by President Bush, because this Merida Initiative has been a prospect before under the Security and Prosperity Partnership that was an extension of NAFTA into the security areas. And we are convinced that the human rights conditions that it finally came out with are completely unsatisfactory and unable to stem what will basically be an empowerment of security forces.
Well, Laura and Tamara, don't go away. We have more questions to ask. We're going to take a very short break here. We're back with more after this.